Welcome, everyone, to the final chapter of our look at the history of Russia. I do believe this goes up through the Russian Revolution. I think they have a separate video on that, which we'll look at some point down the road, but we're going to wrap up this series here. I've heard all of you who have been asking for me to continue the Napoleonic War series from Epic History TV, and I will definitely do that at some point, but not quite yet. So I'm excited to dive into this fifth and final part. As always, the link is in the description, not only to episode 1, if you missed the first 4 episodes and want to get caught up, but also to the original content if you want to watch it without my commentary. Here we go.
In 1881, Russian Emperor Alexander II was assassinated by left-wing terrorists in St. Petersburg. Today, the place where he was fatally wounded is marked by the magnificent Church of the Saviour on Spilled Blood. Alexander II had been a reformer, hailed as the liberator for freeing Russia's serfs. But his son and successor, Alexander III, believed his father's reforms had unleashed dangerous forces within Russia.
So isn't it interesting thinking about the parallels that the man who is most responsible for the freeing of slaves in America, Abraham Lincoln, is assassinated. The man who frees the serfs is assassinated. A lot of times people who bring in radical reforms, even if they're much needed ones, sometimes anger people. And sometimes that anger is misplaced, as we talked about in the last episode.
That ultimately led to his death. As emperor, he publicly vowed to reassert autocratic rule, declaring that, in the midst of our great grief, the voice of God orders us to undertake courageously the task of ruling, with faith in the strength and rightness of autocratic power.
And this is one of those things. You have a choice to make. There's been an assassination. You're coming into power now. Do you continue the reforms, or do you kind of react? And in this case, it's reactionary. It's kind of a knee-jerk back in the other direction. Now, would that have happened anyway? I don't know, because maybe that's how he was thinking. Maybe he opposed Alexander's reforms, and maybe he didn't like it. So maybe he had nothing at all to do with the assassination. Or maybe this was his way of saying, I'm going to stick it to you people. Look at what you did.
A secret police, the so-called Okranka, was ordered to infiltrate Russia's many revolutionary groups. Those found guilty of plotting against the government were hanged or sent into internal exile in Siberia. Alexander III was a pious man who supported the Orthodox Church and the assertion of a strong Russian national identity.
This is about the time when, the 1800s, is when the idea of nationalism starts to take hold. We talked about this at the beginning, that for most of human history, the idea of a nation as we know it today didn't really exist. But this is something that's really starting to happen now. It's not necessarily 100% about your culture or anything like that. It's more about the borders, and the borders determine the nation, and the nation then becomes where your dedication is. Germany has a lot of nationalism. Italy is going to form and start to have this nationalist movement, and Russia's got that too, and a lot of it centers around religion, which is a very common thing, but it's a different form than what you see in most of the other European states.
Russia's Jews became victims of this policy. They'd already been targeted in murderous race riots known as pogroms, after false rumors were spread that they were responsible for the assassination of the emperor.
The 1880s is a time when you see a lot of Eastern European Jews, particularly Russian and Polish Jews, starting to emigrate to places like London, for example. There's a big influx of Eastern European Jews to London and to other parts of the UK. The United States sees a lot of immigration from Eastern European Jews. And this is one of those times, if you're studying genealogy and you have Eastern European Jewish ancestry, there's a good chance that they came over in this kind of 1880 to 1900 time period, or if they came over much more recently, like 1930s, it probably had a lot more to do with what was going on in Germany, for example.
Now the government expelled 20,000 Jews from Moscow, and many who could began to leave the country.
Take a shot.
Over the next 40 years, around 2 million Jews would leave Russia, most bound for the USA.
And that doesn't necessarily seem like a lot, but when you realize there aren't that many Jews in the world at this time, in fact, let's take a look at some numbers. So, obviously, these are all estimates. We can't really know for sure, but just looking right here at the population numbers, in 1880, it's estimated there are 7.8 million Jews in the entire world, and we're talking about a quarter of them fleeing Europe in that time period. So that's a huge chunk of the Jewish population. I mean, even today, what are we talking about? 14 million people. That's a little bit more than the population of Ohio today. And there are some cities that have more than 14 million people. The Jewish population, for all they've been through and all the persecution and all the times they've been involved in history, make up a very small percentage of the population of the world.
Concerned by the growing power of Germany, Russia signed an alliance with France, both sides promising military aid if the other was attacked.
So this is where you are seeing this whole balance of power thing. For the majority of the last several centuries, France has been the dominant land power in Europe. One of the largest countries, largest militaries. You see what Napoleon did. But now that Germany has united, and Germany is an empire, it's still made up of multiple states, multiple kingdoms within Germany that each still have kings. The emperor of Germany is actually also the king of Prussia, but you have princes and other hereditary titles that exist in these various client states of Germany. But now that Germany's all been united, it becomes the dominant power in Europe, and so now it realigns all of the European powers to balance that power out.
Sergei Witte was appointed Russia's new Minister of Finance. His reforms helped to modernize the Russian economy and encourage foreign investment, particularly from its new ally, France. French loans helped Russia to develop its industry and infrastructure. Work began on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Completed in 1916, it remains the world's longest railway line, running.
And we talked about that distance and just how huge this area was. And putting that railway in makes it shorter. I mean, not literally shorter, but it shortens that distance in terms of the time it takes to travel. And by this point now, we've got telegraph, and we're eventually going to have radio and a telephone by 1891. And so the communication lines and the distance to travel have been vastly reduced in a couple of decades.
5,772 miles from Moscow to Vladivostok. Alexander III was succeeded by his son, Nicholas II. His coronation was marred by tragedy when 1,400 people were crushed to death at an open-air celebration in Moscow.
Kind of a foreshadowing kind of thing there that's happening about what his reign's going to look like. This is not the last time there'll be mass casualties on his watch.
China granted Russia the right to build a naval base at Port Arthur. When China faced a major revolt known as the Boxer Rebellion, Russia moved troops into Manchuria under the pretext of defending Port Arthur from the rebels. This brought Russia into conflict with Japan, who also had designs over Manchuria and Korea.
Which, of course, we know they will take later on, and starting to see the seeds of what will become the Russo-Japanese War, which on paper should have been very one-sided in favor of the Russians.
The Japanese made a surprise attack on Port Arthur, then defeated the Russian army at the giant Battle of Mukden. Russia's Baltic fleet, meanwhile, had sailed halfway around the world to reach the Pacific, where it was immediately annihilated at the Battle of Tsushima.
Tsushima is one of those incredibly important and almost universally unknown battles. Just incredibly decisive. And the Russo-Japanese War, well, it's one of those things I never learned about growing up. I've only in my last few years started to learn a little bit about it. Is really important because it's kind of the one of the dress rehearsals for the First World War, and a lot of the things we're going to see in World War I, we see happening here in this war, and should have given us a little clue as to what to expect. Let's talk a little bit more about the Russo-Japanese War, specifically the Battle of Tsushima. So just take a look at how one-sided this is. We're talking about the Japanese having 5 battleships, 23 cruisers, 20 destroyers, and 16 torpedo boats, which is many more than the Russians had. The Russians had more battleships, but less of everything else. And the Japanese lose 3 torpedo boats, 117 dead. The Russians lose 5,000 dead, 6,000 captured. They lose 7 battleships and 14 other ships, and then another 2 battleships captured. So they basically lose the entire fleet, 127,000 tons of ships lost. That whole fleet is lost. It's just as absolutely devastating as it could possibly be.
Russia was left with no option but to sign a humiliating peace, brokered by US President Theodore Roosevelt.
Which got him Theodore Roosevelt, the only person to have both a Medal of Honor and a Nobel Peace Prize. And he got the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in negotiating the end of the Russo-Japanese War. Didn't get the Medal of Honor until the Clinton administration, which was many years after his son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., had already received his Medal of Honor.
Meanwhile, the Tsar faced another crisis much closer to home. In St. Petersburg, a strike by steel workers had escalated, and plans were made for a mass demonstration. Tens of thousands of protesters marched to the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar, asking for better workers' rights and more political freedom. But instead, troops opened fire on the crowds, killing more than 100.
Like I said, not the last time there will be mass casualty events in Nicholas II's reign.
The Sunday, as it became known, led to more strikes and unrest across the country.
There are a lot of bloody Sundays in history.
The crew of the battleship Potemkin mutinied, killing their officers and taking control of the ship. To defuse the crisis, Nicholas II reluctantly issued the October Manifesto, drafted under the supervision of Sergei Witte. It promised an elected assembly and new political rights, including freedom of speech, and was welcomed by most moderates. Russia's first constitution was drafted the next year. For the first time, the Tsar would share power with an elected assembly,
Duma.
the State Duma.
On paper, anyway, he shared a tiny bit of power with the Duma. It was really more just to placate everybody, and he thought maybe that would be enough to get everybody to calm the heck down, but it didn't.
Though the Tsar had the right to veto its legislation and dissolve it at any time.
So what power does it really have?
Sergei Witte finally lost the Tsar's confidence and was dismissed. The Tsar's new Prime Minister, Stolypin, introduced land reforms to help the peasants, while dealing severely with Russia's would-be revolutionaries, so much so that the hangman's noose got a new nickname: Stolypin's necktie. But having survived several attempts on his life, Stolypin was shot and killed by an assassin at the Kiev Opera House.
Interesting where that happened.
Meanwhile, Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian faith healer, had joined the imperial family's inner circle.
So I watched a movie the other day, and some of you maybe have seen it. It was the prequel to the Kingsman series. Pretty fascinating. Obviously, take some liberties with history because it inserts people into historical events that weren't really there. But it's actually pretty cool in that we get to see a lot of these people portrayed. Rasputin's a major character in it. We see his assassination, and it largely it's actually kind of interesting how much of the historical events they try to get right, kinda. Like, the way that Rasputin dies is pretty accurate. It's just the wrong people killing him historically, but it's a cool movie. You see Gavrilo Princip and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. You have the same actor playing King George V and Kaiser Wilhelm and Nicholas II, which is kind of cool because George V and Nicholas II were first cousins. Their mothers were sisters, and they could have been twins. They looked just like each other. And then George V and Wilhelm II are first cousins, both being grandsons of Queen Victoria.
Thanks to his unique ability to ease the suffering of the Tsar's hemophiliac son, Alexei.
And so hemophilia runs in the descendants of Queen Victoria, a lot of inbreeding going on, and they carry that gene. And most people speculate now that what was happening was that Alexei had been prescribed aspirin by his doctors. And of course, we know now that aspirin's a blood thinner. And if you have a disease where your blood won't clot, the worst thing you can do is take a blood thinner. So all Rasputin probably did was take him off the aspirin, which made his condition better. But it gave him an in with the royal family. And this is one of the seeds that's going to spell the end of Nicholas as Tsar.
Despite sporadic acts of terrorism, Russia now had the fastest growing economy in Europe. Agricultural and industrial output were on the rise. Most ordinary Russians remained loyal to the Tsar and his family.
And honestly, had it not been for the outbreak of the World War, Russia was well on its way to superpower status just by the things that were happening. But the World War, the revolution, all of that kind of gets in the way.
Russia's future seemed bright. In 1914, in Sarajevo, a Slav nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, sparking a European crisis. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Emperor Nicholas ordered the Russian army to mobilize, to show his support for a fellow Slav nation. Austria-Hungary's ally, Germany, saw Russian mobilization as a threat and declared war.
And the reason mobilization was a threat is because and I've talked about this a lot, I don't want to kind of belabor the point, but if you're new to the channel, the mindset at the time was this idea called the cult of the offensive. And everybody believed that the way you win a war was to attack, attack, attack. And if you get attacked, counterattack. That the attacker always had such an overwhelming advantage that the defender could not win, which we know in hindsight was ridiculous and quite the opposite of what was true in World War I. But that was the idea. And so as soon as Russia begins to mobilize, everybody else feels like they have no choice. They have to go to war. Because if Russia mobilizes, that means they've got the jump on you, and they're going to be able to attack you if you don't also mobilize. And so you have to attack before they mobilize and attack you. And so it was just a recipe for disaster. And they begged Russia in a final meeting during this, what we call the July crisis, to stop mobilizing. Germany said, just back down, just stop mobilizing. And I think if Russia had decided not to mobilize, the whole thing could have calmed down and been avoided. It's much more complicated than that. But for all the blame Germany gets, and Germany bears a lot of responsibility for the war. Russia held the key in their hand. They could have stopped the whole thing if they just backed down. And at the end, I'll put up a link and I'll mention a couple of things that you can watch where we've talked about the July crisis and also World War I a lot more in depth.
Europe's network of alliances came into effect, and soon all the major powers were marching to war.
This is a result of all of that balance of power stuff we've been talking about. It triggers one thing after another. Austro-Hungary declares war on Serbia, which means Russia has to declare on Austro-Hungary. Germany declares war on Russia. Now France has to go in against Germany because Russia's their ally. And then Germany attacks through Belgium to get around France's defenses, which brings Britain into the war.
World War I had begun. Russia experienced a wave of patriotic fervor. The capital, St. Petersburg, was even renamed Petrograd to sound less German. An early Russian advance into East Prussia ended with heavy defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. There was greater success against Austria-Hungary, but that too came at a high price. Russian losses forced the army to make a general retreat in 1915. In 1916, Russia's Brucilov offensive against Austro-Hungarian forces was one of the most successful Allied attacks of the war.
And I'm not going to spend a lot of time kind of making observations about the World War I stuff because I've done that in other videos already, and I'll just invite you to check those out.
But losses were so heavy that the Russian army was unable to launch any more major operations. In Petrograd, Rasputin, whose alleged influence over the Tsar's family was despised by certain Russian aristocrats, was murdered, possibly with the help of British agents.
Interesting that they say possibly with the help of British agents, because of course that's the theory that you see in the movie I was talking about earlier, was that the British sent agents to get rid of Rasputin so that Nicholas can focus on the war, because they need Russia to keep in the war and to deal with Germany on the Eastern Front so that they can have more success on the Western Front. Because the whole idea with the Brusilov offensive is while the Brusilov offensive is going on, the Somme offensive is going to be going on the Western Front, and Germany's not going to be able to deal with all of that at the same time. But they can't have a distracted Nicholas II dealing with the crazy guy. And if there's ever been somebody in history who looked like the crazy mad monk, it was Grigory Rasputin.
The war put intolerable strains on Russia. At the front, losses were enormous, while in the cities, economic mismanagement led to rising prices and food shortages. In Petrograd, the workers' frustration led to strikes and demonstrations. Troops ordered to disperse the crowds refused and joined the protesters instead.
When you take a country that's already been dealing with unrest for decades, and there's been these regular outbreaks of revolution going back 100 years, and now you add to it one of the most destructive wars in history and millions of casualties in your army, you can't be surprised when there's revolution on a scale that you can't put down.
The government had lost control of the capital. On board the imperial train at Pskov, senior politicians and generals told the emperor he must abdicate.
And that was the key in the end, is when you lose the army, you've got nothing. Because at least as long as you have the army, you can enforce something. You can try and exert some control. But as soon as the generals start coming to you and saying that, same thing happened with Napoleon in 1814, the first time that he is defeated. The generals are the ones that come to him and say, it's done. It's over. You have to give up. You have to abdicate.
Or Russia would descend into anarchy and lose the war. Nicholas accepted their advice and renounced the throne in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael,
who immediately said nope.
Effectively declined the offer. 400 years of Romanov rule were at an end. Russia was now a republic. A provisional government took power, but could not halt Russia's slide into economic and military chaos. Workers, soldiers and peasants elected their own councils, known as Soviets.
And that's where you're going to get the Soviet Union.
The Petrograd Soviet was so powerful it was effectively a rival government, especially as discontent with the provisional government continued to grow. The Bolsheviks, under Vladimir Lenin, attracted growing support, with their radical proposals for an immediate end to the war.
So while there's the theory that the British were involved in dealing with Rasputin, there's no doubt that the Germans helped get Lenin back into Russia because he had been exiled. He was in Switzerland, and the Germans kind of opened their doors to him passing through and kind of helped him along his way to get back into Russia because they knew that he could go in there and wreak havoc, and that's exactly what Germany wanted to have happen.
The redistribution of land and transfer of power to the Soviets. In October, they launched a coup, masterminded by Leon Trotsky. Bolshevik Red Guards stormed the Winter Palace, where the provisional government met, and arrested its members.
So, if you've ever seen the movie Hunt for Red October, the October Revolution, that's where that name comes from.
Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now in charge. Russia had been thrown upon a bold and dangerous course. Under a Marxist-inspired revolutionary party, it would now seek to create the world's first communist state. But first, it would have to survive the chaos and slaughter of one of history's bloodiest civil wars.
Yep. All right, so the Russian Civil War is kind of the natural follow-up to this, and we'll get into that at some point, but not right away. I'm going to throw up a couple of links for you. One is to my reaction to their series on World War I. The playlist will be up there in a link. The other one is the link to the playlist for Extra History's look at the July Crisis, which is fantastic and one of my favorite series I've ever done a reaction to. So if you want to check out one or both of those, you can do so right there. Please hit the like button if you would, and if you're new to the channel, I hope you'll consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.